I'm Garrett McQueen.
I'm Scott Blankenship.
And this is Trilloquy, True and Real Stories from the Fringes of Classical Music. Shout out to technology. Scott and I are able to practice our social distancing, so we are in our respective homes. You are feeling cozy and safe where you are?
Yeah, I feel fine physically. And I've got the little basement studio set up here. Actually, this is pretty cool.
Yeah.
But I was out walking Radar today, and it was just so weirdly still.
Yeah. So as we tape this, we're still in the heat of the COVID-19 coronavirus scare. It's impacting, mental health, but it's having a huge impact on people's pockets, namely folks in the service industry, any industry that deals with people, and even the music industry, as we talked about in the last Opus. And in that last Opus, I offered a couple of resources for folks looking for ways to support artists and musicians during this time. I actually brought in a couple more for this Opus. So Quanice Floyd may be a name that folks, that regular Trilloquy listeners will recognize. She heads the Arts Administrators of Color Network, and she has the Arts Leaders of Color Emergency Fund. So there will be a link to that in the description of this episode. I also found a website called equalsounds.org. They have a Corona Relief Fund for musicians. Many of the initiatives I saw required membership, so some sort of union or institution affiliation, but that looks like one that's open to anyone. So again, the descriptions and links to that will be in the description of this Opus. Scott, have you have seen any economic impact in your direct community? I know you have ties with some of the local businesses in your area.
Well, all of the bars and restaurants have closed down. And, you and me and Dell talked a little bit about maybe we should go out while we still can. And then everything went on lockdown really, really quickly. And so my heart goes out to the people at Tongue in Cheek and Brunson's Pub, the two home bases over here on the east side of St. Paul.
Yeah, shout out to them. And as we continue to explore ways to support artists and all individuals impacted financially by this crisis, be sure to just reach out to us if there's an initiative that you think needs some attention or needs a spotlight. Just shoot us a note at trilloquy@americanpublicmedia.org, and we'll make sure that we get them a shout out. It's really important that we pull together our fiscal resources, but also our social resources. So be sure to spread links and share the news on ways to combat the impacts of this really just horrible health scare. All right, so we're here at the end of Women's History Month, the final opus of Trilloquy for Women's History Month. It's been a really great month for me. Scott, do you have any standout moments or things that you've learned this month that you didn't know before?
So I recorded an episode of Hop Notes with Urban Growler in St. Paul, and it's two married women that fought some really almost insurmountable odds to open up their tap room, and now they're one of the best in the state. They are the first woman-owned brewery in the state. And through my conversations with them, I started to look back at brewing history, and women were more frequently brewers than men. It was part of the household chores, So what a great discovery. Obviously, you and I talked with Elle.
Yes.
She's with Brewing for Change.
The Brewing Change Collaborative. So shout out to them.
She had some great information to share, too. But musically, there's obviously all the Fanny Mendelssohn, the Clara Schumann, blah, 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 blah. But do you know the name Amanda Maier?
I don't.
She ended up marrying Julius Röntgen. You probably
the composer, sure,
right.
Sure.
But she was the first woman to graduate with a degree in conducting, 1872, at the Royal College of Music in Stockholm.
Oh, wow.
So A cool Nordic tie-in there, and a woman named Kate Moore. She composes and plays cello, but she's teamed up with cellist Ashley Bathgate, and the two of them use loop pedals and things like that in their performances. It's just some really interesting music that borders on something that you might hear on a pop station.
Sure, sure. For me, when I hear you talk about the misconception that brewing was a man-run thing and how really it was most of the women, that takes my mind to some of the conversations we had this month on Trilloquy concerning rock and roll music, the guitar. How folks who are women are really at the forefront of so much of that genre. So again, another huge shout out to the late Sister Rosetta Tharpe, a name that I think so many more people need to know. But I'll tell you, Scott, one of the things that I've really had to explore in a real way this Women's History Month is intersectionality as it applies to race and gender. So, a question that I got a lot over the past few weeks was, how do I deal with my focus on racial equity as it applies to gender? And it just makes me think about the fact that even in Women's History Month, historically and in many ways in a contemporary way, the achievements of Black women specifically have really just been overlooked. And in the conversation that I have with today's guest, we get into that a little bit. Her name is Janis Lane-Ewart. She is a local to the Twin Cities. She works for a radio station, KBEM. And one of the first things that really drew me to her in our very first conversation, probably about a year ago now, is the fact that she got to see Nina Simone live multiple times. And of course, Nina Simone is one of the pillars when it comes to music and activism and feminism. But she urged me to check out another artist that she actually brings up in the conversation today, a woman named Amina Claudine Myers. Were you familiar, or are you familiar with her at all, Scott?
Not at all.
Yeah, I wasn't either. So I took the opportunity to look up some of her music, to read up about her, and as we wrap up Women's History Month here on Trilloquy, I wanted to make sure that I gave her a shout out and offered you listening the opportunity to kind of learn about her aesthetic. This is an excerpt of a tune of hers called African Blues. And then, of course, as you can hear in that excerpt, the so-called, classical training, classical technique is very much there. Just another name that we should really just really be exploring. As I think about the importance of Women's History Month, it drives me to something that Janis said at the end of our conversation. I asked her, what should people take forward as we leave Women's History Month so that we just don't forgo these conversations until next year, the way we do in so many ways. And she said that, we have to spark our curiosity. And if there's a woman whose name pops across your screen, a news anchor, just someone in your periphery, take the opportunity to learn something about her. Feed that spirit of curiosity and make sure you're really not overlooking the achievements of women, both famous and in your life. And for me, that really speaks to the selection of many of the guests we have on this podcast. It's really important not to overlook the achievements of women, and Janis is definitely someone who has achieved so much. She's of the age where she had to deal with the real impacts Jim Crow and in the heat of the civil rights movement, and she talks a bit about that in this opus. We also get into an organization called the Association for the Advancement of Creative Music. They're an organization, a Black-led organization that fights for the rights of Black musicians down in Chicago. A really great conversation that I hope that you will enjoy. And again, I just want to underscore one more time, it's that sense of curiosity. Janis may not be someone who you've heard of or someone who will ever cross your path, whether you're local to Minnesota or not. But the stories that she has to tell are just really inspirational to me. So I hope you'll enjoy this. And then at the end of this opus, there's going to be a performance by Lara Downes that I'll talk a little bit more about after we get through the interview. So, Scott, before we jump into it, I want to ask you, are you familiar with an artist by the name of Dinah Washington?
Sure.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So in my conversation with Janis, we talk about her musical upbringing, and she says that she grew up in a rhythm and blues home where there was always rhythm and blues playing and dancing going on in the living room. And when I asked her to think of an artist that she connects with those memories, she mentioned Dinah Washington. So as we get into our conversation with Janis Lane-Ewart, I thought we listened to a little bit of a tune by Miss Washington called "What a Difference a Day Makes." And these days, that's absolutely true, isn't it?
It is.
Yeah. So take a listen to this excerpt of Dinah Washington, and I hope you enjoy our conversation with Janis Lane-Ewart.
Find romance on your menu. What a difference a day made, and the difference is you.
Janis, it's such a pleasure to finally get you here. Glad you're feeling better and above the weather. And yeah, thanks for coming in.
Thank you. I feel particularly privileged today to be able to be out and not constrained by the current circumstances, knowing that there are many who are not sitting up and out and having the ability to come and converse with you at this point in time.
Yeah, with the virus and all that stuff going on, I actually thought about asking you a question. Something I hadn't thought about was how this pandemic impacts musicians. Their gigs getting canceled. Is that
right.
something that you've been thinking about?
Oh, not only am I thinking about it, I arrived home last night to learn that a gig my husband had been contracted for 5 months ago that would pay several $1,000s was shut down yesterday.
Oh my goodness!
He already purchased a ticket to be gone tomorrow for a month on a project with 5 other musicians who are spread across the Midwest and the East Coast.
Yeah, and it just speaks to how issues like these, really impact those of us who work for a living more than others, and it's not something that people always think about. We may have to circle back around to that, but the more entrenched I get in this social justice and racial equity work as it applies to music, the more I really treasure these stories of the past. It's one thing to go on the internet and read a Wikipedia article about something, but you have experienced so much. And I know the last time we sat and chat, you talked about your experience seeing Nina Simone a couple times live.
Exactly.
I wonder if you would talk a little bit more about that.
Yes, I am reminded of her presence because there's many articles that talk about her in very positive ways. There are others that have covered her more sensitive side or temperamental side. And I have fortunately seen her twice where I was in the second row and she was at the grand piano and amazed us with her versatility, her ability to not only tell a story as she's singing, but to then segue in the middle of a song and give you a rendition of a historical incident that she was involved in that's related to the specific song that she's singing.
Mm-hmm.
She's gracious. She is or was an amazing queen after performances where she would allow people to come and speak with her. She was eloquent and very giving of her time.
Yeah. And you say was, but for me, she is. She very
Yes.
much is. I mean, she's definitely one of my favorite musicians, maybe even my most favorite, just because of what her legacy means, and the way she could not separate conversations of womanhood from blackness, from
Yes.
being a musician.
Yes.
And I wonder how you deal with the conversation of that space between blackness and womanhood as it applies to Women's History Month. Because during Black History Month, there are certain names we know and learn,
Yes.
but it seems like that bit of equity isn't always there for Women's History Month.
I would say that's the case, and that was particularly for me. My thoughts for today, I thought I should be prepared and look up some information.
Oh,
and
sure.
It put me to the point where I actually went online to a African American registry site where there's information about Black women and International Women's Day, and gives the history of IWD from the perspective of those who were consistently noted and talked about at the time the registry opened, and that it really focused around people like German delegates Claire Zetkin, or someone from the 1910 International Socialist Women's Conference, women from the Socialist Party of America.
Mm-hmm.
One article specifically made no mention of African American women in the early days of International Women's Day. And I found that evocative as well as informative. It's not often that that's a point of conversation on IWD issues.
Yeah. And something that I had planned on asking you last month was, what is wrong with this idea of Black History Month? And you're really laying out a similar story when it comes to Women's History Month. And that's why I really wanted to make sure that we started this conversation with a shout out to Nina Simone,
Yes.
because she is just one of the many Black women who kind of get forgotten when it comes to these conversations. On this podcast, maybe last episode or a few episodes ago, we talked a little bit about Sister Rosetta Tharpe.
Yes.
A name that many people just don't know, but she is seminal to music. And I'm sure with your experience in the world of so-called jazz, that there are a plethora of names that you could throw out that we don't really think about.
Yes. This is quite an aside, but an African-American composer and pianist and forerunner in the state of New York, particularly New York City. I'll bring to my forefront Amina Claudine Myers. She is a pianist. She is a composer. She has performed across 3 or 4 continents, and she has consistently maintained her perspective as an African-American composer and performer. And that's always evident in her performances, not only by the music that she chooses to perform. She plays her own compositions, but she also then heralds back to music of Nina Simone or others of her ilk that many don't know anymore because that music is difficult to find on commercial stations, certainly on some community-based stations,
Right.
but they are no longer household names as they were in my era.
And, when we talk about the names that are overlooked, it's important, I think, to acknowledge the names that aren't overlooked. And, our first professional interaction was in a pre-concert talk with the Minnesota Orchestra. But,
Yes.
Leading up to that event, there were so many nerves. And I want to say that it seemed like there were so many, but there actually were. Where do you think those nerves come from? Why are so for folks who don't know, we were tasked with tackling the issue of cultural appropriation as it applies to the music of George Gershwin. And then when you start talking about race and music, things, some people get a little bit uncomfortable. Where do you think that discomfort comes from?
Well, my personal opinion is that we are still at a point where we as a society feel comfortable treating each other as equals. 50-50, 100-100, not 32 and 150. Those dynamics still remain with us. And while we have many examples of having overcome some of the most horrific differences in balance, we witnessed clearly in that day of conversation that there was still trepidation. The ability to feel comfortable on either side of the color spectrum and saying exactly what you've experienced and or now feel can be alarming for some people or uncomfortable. The possibility that he or she may be considered racist by a particular remark when he or she doesn't feel that that's their persona can make you feel like you're on a hot seat.
Lately, I've been saying that folks are more afraid of being called a racist than being a racist.
Yes. Yes.
And not that that's a word, what I think is often forgotten is that, we aren't out here to just, point the finger and call everyone racist. But at the end of the day, there are certain practices that exist, that have roots there, and you can go all the way back to Jim Crow, and certainly when it comes to music, there are just practices that have siphoned certain individuals and certain conversations away from the front. So
Yes.
people get uncomfortable when we bring them to the front.
Yes, that's true.
Are conversations like those? You're a professional in the world of jazz, but do you cross over into classical very often when it comes to many conversations at all?
Only when I feel comfortable with the information that I'm sharing, that I know I am not speaking out of tongue or speaking out of character. I really make an effort to rely on what I specifically know and or have experienced, because both are valid. And if I'm unsure, I really do ask the person with whom I'm engaged to share what they know, because it's teaching me as well as the listening audience or for whomever is in the room. I at no point profess to be totally in touch and on top of everything that's happening in the field. I do have a particular interest towards music and musicians and composers that are in the African American community, because it's where I still exist and mostly reside. But I also feel great that I can tell you about some people from other cultures who are active and performing. And I do have an interest in seeking out musicians and composers that I don't know, that I hear on NPR or that I hear on KMOJ or that I hear on the variety of stations that I'm engaged in when I'm driving.
Yeah. And, one of the things that put me, in my work on the map for all intents and purposes is, exploring the relationship between gender and classical and race and classical. But when it comes to jazz, it seems like conversations of race have to be at the forefront. It seems like there's no separating that conversation.
Yes. I say that because of the history of jazz musicians finding it difficult to be hired in certain gigs, or in certain examples, a band that was primarily white would not be as well attended in a black community. And there were, as I've been told, some unofficial combinations where if you had a quintet, it was expected that you had at least 2 black people in the band. Things of that sort are not so much found in history. I learned those things from the African American composers and musicians that I've come to know over time. And when they share stories about going to different cities or different sites and what was required for them to be considered a band that could play in sometimes a segregated
Right,
audience.
right. I kind of want to rewind and go back to your musical beginnings. I think I read that you were raised in a rhythm and blues household. But what is a rhythm
That's
and blues
right.
household?
That is a household where the majority of the music that's coming out of the Grundig record player is music that you can dance to and or sing to. When I was growing up, the popular mode of dance was called the bop, which
Okay,
is man and a woman or two girls if you didn't have any brothers in the house.
sure.
And you start out holding hands and you do steps with your feet that are very specific. There's a rhythm. If you mess up the rhythm, they don't ask you to dance with them anymore. And it's with music that's rhythm and blues primarily, men and or women.
Yeah, and when it came time for you to, seek higher education, you initially thought law would be the world you lived in, but
Yes,
you two-stepped back over into music.
I did. I attended a concert at a place in Chicago called Ratzo's, and one of my sorority sisters is a vocalist, and she was performing that night. So I was there to support her, and when I was leaving, long story short, there were two gentlemen sitting by the door, and they were taking notes, and they said, "Do you want to put your name on the mailing list?" And I assumed they meant the mailing list for my sorority sister who was performing there because she was the act that night. I wrote my name down, gave the information, said goodbye, and left. And when I was leaving with my other sorority sister, she said, "You didn't know those people. Why did you give them your information?" I said, "Because I'd like to know when Sonia's going to be singing again." She said, "Well, I don't know if that was the right thing to do." Fast forward one day, I got a call from someone saying their name and that they were performing at such and such place on such and such day. I didn't know the person. And then he went on to say, "And maybe you want to get the Sun-Times today because my performance has been announced in the Sun-Times." Growing up in Chicago, knowing someone, an African American specifically, this was in 1977, that they were featured in the Sun-Times was a very big deal.
Wow.
I didn't recall who the person was. I came to understand later that that's the person I gave my name to.
Okay.
And I went to that concert and I continued to follow that group of musicians moving forward to where I am now. So that took me out of rhythm and blues exclusively. It took me out of what I call maybe a Nat King Cole kind of jazz perspective,
Okay.
and took me into what became later and is still known within the spectrum as avant-garde music.
Oh, wow. How would you, is avant-garde music something that crosses genre, or from your perspective, is it its own separate thing?
I would say it is inclusive of the quote unquote rules of jazz in that you play certain keys a certain way. You don't necessarily try to make one sound clash against the other for no apparent reason. And it is now, in my description, a musical style that is not predictable. You, as an audience member or listening to a recording, you're not necessarily going to be able to hum the next section of the music as you would in some of the early forms of jazz, classical jazz, singing forms of jazz, etc. It's more like being on a roller coaster and you don't know if you're going to make a twist, if you're going to make a deep dive down, if you're going to go up to the top. You're there to experience it, and
A lot like the career of a musician.
yes, very much so. Yes.
Where does your cultural activism tie into this? Because I think I also read that arts administration was a part of your journey, cultural activism.
Yes.
How do those things meld and mesh together?
Well, upon meeting the individuals at that club one night, I learned that they were part of a larger organization called the Association for the Advancement of Creative Musicians. and that they came together for the purpose of ensuring that their individual voices in scoring music would be heard and accessible in community. They had an office space. They seemed to share the responsibilities of managing the organizations. Of course, they had officers. One of the original founders is Muhal Richard Abrams, who is, or excuse me, he's recently deceased, was a composer and a very astute pianist. And when I learned that they were so involved in community and did concerts in communities that were affordable, but they didn't have administrative skills, I began to volunteer for them and did paperwork and had experience doing writing as a college student. So I then embarked upon grant writing for them and became a career for me. I was their executive director for a considerable amount of time. I learned extensive amounts of information about music, presentation, particularly community and primarily male musicians teaching the craft to students. There was a school of music that taught students from 7 to 14 years of age at no charge.
Oh, wow.
Every Saturday morning. And all of those experiences have remained with me in ways that affect the day-to-day work that I'm doing now.
Yeah, and I actually have a couple of AACM questions that I'm going to save for a little later. But when I think about that cultural activism and the role that that organization has in the city of Chicago, I can't help but to think about the blackness that is Chicago. The Florence Price, the first
Yes.
black woman to have a symphony performed, that happened in Chicago.
Yes.
We can talk about the Great Migration. Our first black president came from the city of Chicago.
I knew exactly. I can point out his house in my brain to
Okay,
you.
and okay.
I lived about 6 blocks away from his home.
I wonder how vital that sense of activism and cultural activism and pro-blackness is in a city that already has so much black history and is such a hotbed for black art. Is racial equity and cultural activism something that really needs to happen in a city like Chicago?
It did at the time that I was growing up there. I would say the emphasis is not as heavy here in 2020 as it was in 1977, or at the point where I was extremely active with them from 79 until 1980s,
Okay.
1989.
Okay. Wow. I wonder, and one of the questions I kind of wanted to set aside was, the fact that AACM, African, black, none of those words are in the title
That's
of
right.
the organization. What was the climate of the 70s? Did that have something to do with it? It seems like such a pro-black organization would outwardly, affirm that mission.
My informed response would be the word African American at the time they came together in some communities was laughed at. And
Oh, that's interesting.
well, there were many people who would not say African American. They'd say, hey, that nigga over there. And that was an experience that I knew of in grammar school and in high school. On the day that there was a race riot in Chicago during Martin Luther King's visit there, I went to a technical high school that was predominantly white, and I had to walk home some 25 blocks because I wasn't allowed to get on the bus in that neighborhood on that particular day. So there are key points that come and go with me, and the fact that the organization chose to say African American at that time certainly suggests to me the political and social impacts that they were dealing with and how they wanted to move ahead and maintain their sense of humanity that is rightfully due to all of us.
It's one thing for for me to get angry and get ready to march based on, what I read and about what happened, what I've read about the past and what I've been told about the past. But, you actually live this. How do you move forward? How do you have peace of mind with experiences like those?
I have peace of mind because I have to be cognizant that I made it through and that I did so because I had parents that were middle class people who worked. The father who raised me was a policeman. The father who gave me birth worked at the post office. All of the people that were seminal in my life who were adults were working hard to maintain the ability to be stated as African American as opposed to many other nomenclatures that they heard behind their back, or laughingly someone would make a joke and they were supposed to say ha ha. So it suggests to me the founders of the AACM were raised in those similar communities and similar situations with mothers, fathers, aunts, and uncles, and they were very specific about how they wanted to be identified.
I wonder if the music that kind of existed in your periphery and in your circle at that time reinforced some of these challenges and what had to be done. So certainly, Nina Simone did not separate the
No.
activism from the music, but I wonder if that musical culture is one that sort of permeated, the culture and the climate.
I would say so, particularly when I think back on the names of the compositions that the musicians created, and that there was often some connection to what was very specific to African Americans or Black people, and the fact that the places where they performed were in communities where they were open to anyone who came, but they were in what we call Black communities. In sometimes a storefront, a person would have a small bar and they would allow the musicians to perform there. Or during the daytime, their place was a restaurant, but at night on Tuesdays, it'd be a place where they could play and continue to put forth a sense of consciousness.
When most folks think back to those days, specifically, when it comes to civil rights and all that sort of thing, from a lot of people's perspective, it was the church and gospel and all that sort of thing that centered, the activism. But it sounds like up north, it was more of the restaurants and bars.
I would say that was certainly that I grew up in an environment that it was very centered in churches and religious sites, etc. However, as the sons and daughters of African Americans who worked in the steel mills and at the post office, etc., came to fruition and came into their own being, the recognition that there were other links within the community in addition to the church, to which the music and the conversations and the sense of growth could be expanded, why not do that? There's never just one pea in the pod.
Yeah.
And I believe they took to heart the importance of invigorating the community in as many ways as possible, and not in the, quote, one temple that exists within a community of African Americans.
Do you feel like that unity is there today? Have we taken a step forward or a step back when it comes to that Black unity, having the meeting place? Right now I'm thinking about James Baldwin, who said, the most segregated time in America is high noon on Sunday. That is definitely still the case to an extent. But I'm wondering if you feel or see that unity in 2020 outside of the church hall, outside of the bar or the restaurant.
Oh, Well, I do, and I do because I am not confined to any one specific form of engagement in the community. I listen and go to concerts by an Asian performer, Gao Hong, who
Yeah, she
plays.
plays the pipa. Yeah,
Yes,
shout out to
right.
her. Yeah.
That's right. I can go to another example where on the past 4 Saturdays I go and listen to bluegrass. I couldn't have told you what bluegrass was if you paid me until, 4 or 5 years ago, very recently. And I see some people who look like me in those concerts, in those concert halls. And when I don't, it reminds me that the next time I'm buying a ticket, that I'll buy a ticket for someone else and say, hey, come with me. We're going to go see so and so and so. And I don't give a, when I buy tickets for other people, I don't give a long explanation. I just say, hey, let's go hang out. And typically they come away with, wow, what was that? Or I never heard about that. Or what was she doing? And it's a great extension of conversation that then goes into other communities.
But, despite the fact that folks like you and me will explore and go into some
Yes.
music, by and large, the classical concert hall is 99.99.99% white.
Yes.
Surely you would say that, well, I won't put words in your mouth, but it seems like for me, there is a responsibility on the part of those institutions. We can't change the audience if what is happening on stage doesn't change.
Exactly. And I'm not aware of any specific cultural pressure at this point for the producers and the executive directors and the other decision-making people on boards of directors related to orchestra music are having these conversations. I won't even go to the point of saying how often I don't see people like myself in those audiences, because it's not saying, okay, I've said it, but it's not speaking to the audience that needs to hear and take action. And those are the decision makers in the field of orchestra.
And I think that's the key. We aren't yet in those decision-making seats.
That's correct.
If you were in one of those decision-making seats, what do you think some of the things would be that you bring forward? Because if the best orchestra in the world decides to program music by Black composers, that in itself isn't going to get us in the concert hall.
No, and just because the music is written by African Americans does not mean that the performers would be African American.
That as well.
Right.
That as well.
I wanted to be very specific
Yeah.
about that.
Yeah.
And at this point, conversations such as those we're having now really require consistency across fields. We talk about this within the music field. There are probably like-minded people within sculpture, within the fine arts, expanding our ability to converse across artistic fields of expression, I think can't hurt us. It's more likely going to be helpful. And taking a little more energy at events when you're asked, for example, when I go to the Ordway to fill out a response card, and being very specific and saying at the end, when it says anything else, I might write down the names of musicians that would be appropriate at that particular venue.
Oh, wow. I hope you've written my name down.
I didn't know
I'm
what
just kidding.
instrument you played.
And for folks who don't know, the Ordway is home of the St. Paul Chamber Orchestra, Minnesota Opera,
Yes.
and all this. Well, don't tell them that I can sing,
Okay.
As long as we can make that deal. I want to transition a bit into your role on the radio. When I got into public radio a few years ago, I was just, I still remember, I'll never forget that first pledge drive, that first membership drive.
Yes.
I was just so moved by the community effort and the community aspect of it. But, a couple of minutes ago, you mentioned those barriers. And from my perspective, there are generations of practices that have just become normal when it comes to radio programming, and it seems like one of those barriers, at least from my perspective, is fighting against those traditions. Folks don't want to talk about issues of racial equity and gender equity. That turns people off. Is that something that you consider a barrier or a challenge?
Well, because we interview an array of people on radio at KBEM, but it is never connected to issues that you've just raised. It's typically it's typically in relationship to the composition or the history of the musician or composer. It is centered around where the musician might be traveling, etc.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess what I really want to say, it doesn't cross over into sociological or psychological kinds of interaction.
Yeah. But as we've already, established, in many cases, there is no separation of those things.
Well, we started that off talking about Nina Simone, and her lyrics and her delivery certainly exudes a fullness of her life that she had no compunction in sharing with all of her audiences.
Yeah, most famously, I always bring up that tune, Mississippi Goddamn.
Yes.
When it gets into the biting cold, when it's 20 below and 30 below here in Minnesota, my partner likes to say Minnesota goddamn. So as we wrap up here, I want to talk about musical definitions. So as someone who's not in front of the mic, but someone who plays a big role in what makes it onto the air, are there conversations of how you define jazz, how you define creative music, what is appropriate for air at your station?
No, there are not conversations at that level. We do get phone calls and people will express themselves, which I'm happy to say.
You say that so nicely. They express themselves.
Yes, they do. And at times I am delighted that they're calling because they've not heard anything like that and they're enjoying it. At other times they're not finding it to their palate, but they're open to the conversation as to why it's being shared. And we're always mindful that they can turn the dial as opposed to even calling to express their thoughts. So we remain open to all points of communication.
When it comes to lifting those very rigid guidelines, those barriers, when it comes to way we siphon certain bits of music, do you think there would be benefits there on the classical side? I wonder if you think it would be beneficial to organizations like orchestras, like classical radio stations, to just erase definitions and to expose people to music.
Yes, particularly it raises the question for me, are there not listeners to orchestral music that make comments to orchestra members, to performers, to those who make those decisions? Because there is such a diversity throughout the universe, I find it hard to believe that there aren't people listening to classical music who've raised questions or offered suggestions for bending what's presented. It's sometimes seen at the Ordway when the orchestra performs, and the program for that evening also includes two other acts that are not classical. I've enjoyed those experiences, particularly because there's often an opportunity to hear resident musicians in that setting who are accompanied by maybe just the brass section or the percussion session. And that's how it should be.
Yeah. How do you define that? You say things that aren't classical. How do you define classical? What does that even mean?
Well, I'll go back to where we started, listening to records on our Grundig system at home, if there's no point within the composition that you can't snap your fingers or sing back to yourself some part of the melody, then it is possibly classical music.
lack of soul, lack of seasoning. Kind of.
There's something within myself that, or within my spirit, my training, my upbringing, I'm not sure what, or maybe being untrained. I should admit that I can't sing back to you a portion of a classical composition.
Well, we'll have to fix that.
Okay.
I'll send you some recordings. My last question, as we exit Women's History Month, unfortunately, many people will, forego certain conversations until, this time next year. If someone needs to take one thing with them to not forget about, despite the fact that it's not Women's History Month, what would that be? What do people need to take with them into April and May and June and beyond?
I would ask people to take their sense of curiosity into effect in the next 3 months and push yourself to open an encyclopedia, go on the web, and list a name of some woman, and find out more about that person. If you listen to the news regularly and a particular female reporter's name is often noted, what do you know about her beyond her representation in that moment? What's her background? Where was she born? What happened for her in her life prior to that position? And think about that just in your circle of friends. Do you really know who your best friend is? What she has contributed beyond the things you talk about on the phone? Is she in a professional field where you know her work title, but you don't know what she does or how she's contributed to the furtherance of that specific entity?
Wow. I think I'll do that myself. Every time I see a woman's name, I'll make a point to learn something about her. Janis, what an honor to sit here and talk with you. Hearing your stories are so uplifting to me. Thank you for persevering. You went through things that fortunately I will never have to. So I thank you for your work, and I thank you for keep on keeping on, as one of those songs used to say, right?
Yes. Thank you for the opportunity. I want the listeners to know that you're wearing a very fabulous garment. It is a beautiful sweatshirt, and it has the word privileged, and each letter of the word is in a different color. And that, to me, today is very significant. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Janis Lane-Ewart in conversation with Garrett McQueen here on Trilloquy. Garrett, you did that one solo. That one almost didn't happen.
It almost didn't happen. Yeah, we tried to have Janis in on during Black History Month. She got ill again with this coronavirus scare. I was concerned that we wouldn't be able to get this done, but we actually got her into the studios at the very last minute. I mean, as soon as she left, they locked down our building to guests. So a huge thanks to Janis for popping in. And again, just one more time, I would really love to underscore what Janis said at the end there when she talks about sparking that curiosity as we move away from Women's History Month. Remember that, that news anchor you see on TV or that voice you hear on the radio, there's a story there and there are accomplishments there. So I hope that if you're a man or a woman moving forward through the year, that you'll just not let that curiosity die and continue to explore the legacy of women year-round. And again, I would like to remind you that in the description of this opus, we provided a couple more links for ways that you can support artists during this crisis. Again, the Arts Leaders of Color Emergency Fund and the equalsound.org Corona Relief Fund. So be sure to check those out and make your contributions as you're able. Scott, one of the things that Janis and I kind of got into toward the end was, the definition of classical music and the lack of its singability. Janis talked about not really being able to sing a classical melody. So to round out this opus of Trilloquy and to round out Women's History Month here on Trilloquy, I thought it might be great if we hear from a woman named Lara Downes. She's a pianist who has recorded so many pieces of music by women and women of color. She sent this track to me and gave me the permission to use it. It's a tune by Florence Price called First Romance. So Janis, as you're listening to this, I hope you'll be able to catch a melody to sing and hum to your friends. Happy Women's History Month. Thanks so much for listening to Trilloquy. Stay healthy, stay safe, and we will see you next time.